Hi, I'm Brennan Baker, BB Miniatures, and welcome to my latest tutorial on the new Space Marine Jump Captain, which I've painted in the colors of the Dark Angels chapter. First thing to know in this tutorial, and which everything will revolve around, is the use of lighting as a driving focus of this miniature. And when I say lighting, we're going to be talking about lighting commonly referred to as in value, with a simple numerical scale ranging from 1 to 10, 1 being black and 10 being white, all with the numbers in between represented by values of gray. If there's one thing to take away from this tutorial, it's going to be on this topic, as without this understanding and its use, the whole painting tends to fall apart. The second and important note is that this miniature isn't painted to your tabletop miniature standard. Depending on the angle that you view it, there isn't a whole lot of interest going on, especially when it comes to the back. Yeah, you may get a rear view angle, which gets a flash of rim light seen from the main source light, which looks pretty cool. But in honesty, the back is just left the dark green contrast paint airbrushed with no other highlights or brush work involved. Painting this Jump Marine won't land you much at all in a painting competition such as Golden Demon, or actually might look a little bit on the tabletop, probably from your point of view, but your opponent may say otherwise. Rather, I wanted to paint something in the freedom of not being a gaming miniature. In all honesty, I don't play Warhammer 40k. I don't have plans in painting an army for the tabletop, but I already have my gaming bandwidth taken in Games Workshop's other systems of the Horus Heresy, Adeptus Titanicus, and soon to be Legions Imperialis. Hint, hint. But that isn't to say I can't enjoy and love the myriad of worlds, characters, and sculpts out there. Army painting commonly exercises a particular mode of painting that is geared towards methods that lend themselves to quick completion time to get them ready for the battlefield. So with this tutorial, I also wanted to thread a quick working time and bring in techniques we would find right at home on the tabletop standard world, if you want to call it that, and show that a creative fun project is much more approachable and actually a lot closer than you think. I really feel that projects like these are awesome in keeping the hobby fresh and help stretch your creativity. Kind of brings you out of the slog of painting an army, or keeps you from doing the new army ADD, where you see a new single miniature release and think that you need to build an entire army around it. Rather, just paint the hero that you really like that sparks your imagination and feed that creative curiosity. Then you can go back to your army passion, refreshed and ready for more. This actually leads into my third thought. Painting a miniature for the sake of fulfilling a creative thought. This idea for this miniature started actually in a conversation with my best friend in the late summer evening, walking and talking about creative ideas in video games, animation, capturing motion, and just generally just bouncing ideas between each other as we commonly do. He mentioned me about trying a new lighting scheme of painting a god light, a term he used to describe a particular lighting rig that they use in his studio for a singular central light at a focal point descending on a subject at a steep angle. Fast forward a month later, this Jump Captain arrives, and I actually start to see some new lines in the position of the model. The keyword godlight really comes back and into focus, and I knew I had to try it with this model. What's really important is the idea of godlight and the model, and how these two ideas come together, in which I'll give the greatest chance of these ideas colliding together successfully. First, take the term godlight, and I write down a few key words or notes of the feeling that it invokes. Immediately, I get a lot of religious symbolism, which of course the term is derived from. But list them out, and even as a creative exercise, even for you, you should write them down. So words such as holy light, enlightened, faith, resolve, chosen, confrontational, and even the words of test or to be tested. Just some of the words that come to mind that describe what I find of feeling when I get the idea of godlight. Then, when looking back at the sculpt of the Jump Captain and its available options, ideas of faith, confrontation really come to a figure that leads with no regards to his safety or caution. The other options of the swords, which would be cool as well, but not as strong as a power fist position, where the sword is pointed forward or extended outwards, it would actually be the first point of contact of the light. But the power fist, in its clenched fist anchored behind him with his chest open and leading with his head, more symbolizes his forward takeoff, confronting the challenge ahead in faith. This well puts the faith in him as the central focus of the godlight, rather than the weapon, and even if the weapon was there, that could possibly cast a shadow or obscure the subject a little bit too. Before we proceed, I gotta do my little YouTube diligence and politely ask that if you're enjoying the content, please consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you're not already do so. And even more by leaving a comment with your questions and thoughts on the painting that I would absolutely love to hear. Lastly, if you want to watch more of my painting tutorials, consider becoming a patron, where I publish around 3 to 5 tutorials a month, and with the majority exclusive to my Pro Palette patrons. It really helps me going forward to continue what I love, keeps the lights on, no pun intended, and my brush moving. Much love, but let's get back to the tutorial. So bring your attention back to the miniature here. I got it opened up in Photoshop. And as you can see that I have a few color swatches actually being shown in 3 different groups. And the easiest way to approach this model is kind of actually break this up into, like slicing up the model into 3 separate groups. So we can see how the light is going to be cascading downwards, because that's the main feature that we really want to focus on the model. Simply because if we were to, if we were just to use one swatch, and this is our brightest highlight here, it wouldn't make much sense if every single panel or every single modulation of the armor would use this entire scale. That'd be more akin to just an average or just a normal tabletop painting. But in this case, we really want to amplify that the light is really hitting off his head, and it starts to decay as we really move down to the miniature. I've done this in other models as well, but not to this dramatic extent where this literally only has a singular light source. So if we're going to break up the models in approximately, like 3 areas, we're going to first look at the top area, which is kind of in that upper part. The second is going to be in the mid. So pretty much like you see how his knee is risen up there. So we get a little bit more of an open face. And then of course the last one here. So this top will be 1, and then this will be 2, and then the bottom will be 3. Pretty simple and self-explanatory. Oh, I should have actually done that on a separate layer. Really quickly so you can just turn these off. Anytime. Again, 1, 2, 3. So to get some comparisons, let's take a look at the various color swatches and take a look here. So we can look at this value range, and we can actually see in the upper area, our average shadow value is much lighter than the average shadow value, which is down below, where that's pretty much like that's the actual Dark Angel's green. Now, it even might be looking similar when you look at the head. You might think that's actually the Dark Angel's green, but if you take a look, it's actually it's a bit lighter than it is down below. And this comes to the point of we're trying to create a value contrast, but we need to be mindful of the position of where it is. So especially when we take a look at the top, there is a lot of it. Look how large the highlight is. That's probably one of the biggest key takeaways when making this lighting scheme, is at the very, very center, the very, very top. We can look at here, the head and the upper shoulder and part of the backpack here. Is we can see how large the highlight area is actually in contrast. So as we move down the model, we can start to see that the highlight points get smaller. There's just a little bit on his abs, which is not very large at all. It's very, very tiny. And then even in the leg, yes, there are some, we do make some highlights here, but if you look at the lighting, pretty small. Right here, a little bit of an edge highlight and a little bit on the side here. But you can see like the very much the size difference. The head is almost it's pretty much blown out, incomplete in highlight. And even just to critique my work, I almost wish that I did even more. you know, um, bringing more of this color into the sides even more, making it larger. But hey, I can only look at this and kind of learn from it. But the general principle still applies. So at the very very tip of your at the very very highest point of the god light, that's where you want the brightest and the largest of the highlights. And as soon as you start going down, the highlights get smaller and smaller. Even more apparent is when you're looking at the different areas of each. So the upper area, the value range is going to, like again, I said, it's going to start at this value, this darker value. And in a value scale of, again, like 1 to 10, 1 being black and then 10 being white, we can, for all intents and purposes, this is just a little off white. We can see how close it is to white, but there's just a little bit of yellowish green in there. We can pretty much designate this as like our 9 to 10. So it's really, really up there. Not pure white, but you get the idea. But in our shadows, we actually have to go into like a value scale instead of just going to 1, which would be too dramatic in this sense, unless, of course, on the back side of the head, when you turn around, it'd be pretty much 1 because there's no light there. But from the main principal view, and this is how I have to paint it and approach it, I got to make sure that this is like the most banging spot on view there is, because this is like quite the essential hero pose, and the first pose that I also feature when I show people the model. And naturally you kind of just want to turn the model to this position just because of the light play. The interest between contrast is the most it's just the most apparent in the model. But we can see, like, going from the values, we can go, our deepest value within the main subject is around like a 3. So a 3 on the value scale. Still pretty dark, but again, you don't want to go all the way down to like 1, which is down there in that case. And then when we move down to the mid section, as you can see that it takes a step down. Our brightest highlight is not our like 9/10. It's about like our 7, maybe borderline 8 if we hit it around like on the very very edges. And then again, we get more of this half tone here, and then that's like more of our shadow. And going down below to the lowest values here, we're really only getting maybe like the highlight is approximately around this tone. So our half tone in our mid section is actually our highlight for the lower section. So you can kind of see a little bit of a correlation that's going on here. Even more apparent, if I just turn these off, is that we can also get a little bit better understanding of what I mean when we want to look at this in just a value scale. We can actually just take away the color. So by going into here, I'm just going to create a black and white. And there we go. So without any of the colors, I'll turn off the swatches. Without any of the colors, we can even see just in black and white, just our values, that we can really see how much of the value up there is in the highlights. But even in our greatest highlights, like I said, going around here, a little bit darker. Not too much, actually, in our black and white. This is not like a pure, like this is not a true black and white. You still have to do some tweaks in there. But you kind of get the idea, at least when you take a look at the size of the highlights. Look how much of the face is in highlight, because it's facing directly forward. look at over almost like half of the shoulder, or I'd say like a third, or getting close to a half of the shoulder pad is really covered in light, little glimmers of here. And then as we go further downwards, why is it showing everything in black? And maybe it doesn't work. Oh, maybe I have to click on. Yeah, there we go. I was clicking on the white filter by accident. That's why everything was going kind of weird. Apologize. So there's our white highlight, and then even if we take a look at this highlight, we can see there's a little bit of a value scale jump there, or that's a bit darker. Yep. Yeah, so that makes sense now. There we go. So this highlight compared to that highlight, a small little change, but these little changes are just what's really going to help create and sell this effect. And again, like a simple kind of rule of thumb is our max highlights here, we're going to get to like that 9, 10. But then when we get into the mid, probably our max highlight is going to be like 7, maybe 8, especially if we're dealing with shinier objects, or maybe on an edge highlight. And then when we get to the lower area registry, our brightest highlights are really in that, 4, possibly 5 range, just on the very edges of the highlights. But otherwise just fade out to be pretty low in terms of just all the shadows and the lower halftones of registry. This kind of control will really help us bring that into light. And a general, also like a good rule of thumb when you're looking at this is when we're painting, it's always nice to refer, it's easy to get stuck into painting individual parts. Like if we're painting the shoulder pad, it's very easy, okay, we got to create a transition from light to dark. But the one thing that you always have to keep in mind, and it's good to pull the miniature back, hold it at maybe a little more of an arm's length and just give yourself notes every time you're going through the model, is look at this entire image as a whole. Like you can almost look at it as one giant, one big sphere, as you could say. So you can almost look at this as like one big sphere. And you can see that even just as a sphere, if we're shining a light on a sphere and looking at how a sphere gets shaded, it's pretty common to see that we'll have a focal point here, and then it'll start to fade out as it moves away from the central point of light. And this is the same concept here, so we could just use that as a general guide. So if you're ever lost and you're looking at there, just designate some value ranges and make sure that our max highlight here is always going to be the brightest. This max highlight should never be anywhere else around the sides of the model down below. And with that idea in mind, you can't go too far off. So we'll be starting off with the airbrush. I'm going to be doing some airbrush with some white. Then we're going to move to some contrast paints. But other than that, I think that little primer is going to help you out, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the tutorial. So let's get our paints, let's get our models, and let's get started. Alright, so starting off the tutorial, we're going to be starting with a black undercoat. The model is, for the most part, assembled, and just put on a base there. We're going to start by airbrushing some Tamiya flat white. Now, I'm going to be putting this through my airbrush. I got a harder Steinbeck. I believe it's a 0.2 needle, but the most important thing is about thinning our airbrush paints. And this, I'm going to be thinning with Tamiya's X20 thinner in a 1-to-1 ratio approximately. For the most part, every time I airbrush, it's always a 1 part water, or 1 part paint to 1 part thinner. I like to run the airbrush nice and thin and with smooth, slow control as I go through here. Now, we're going to be painting in the light, and this actually more falls into a sketch. When we airbrush the Dark Angels contrast paint, it's it's such a strong pigment, it almost completely annihilates our our white that's shown here. So think of this as less of a pre-illumination, but this is more of, for me, to warm up to the model so I could sketch out the godlight and get a good visual black and white representation, as well as it helps to, you get to see all the various small details of the miniature and they get punched out a little bit more, so we can make a nice mental map of what the model hopefully will look like at the end. Also with this white, it really helps to show how slowly I build things up with the airbrush. A general rule of thumb is when I'm using an airbrush, I set it around 2 bars or about 28 psi. That's close to 30. But the real hero of this, besides keeping your paint thin, is the amount that you pull the trigger back, or what I call how open do you like to use the airbrush. A general rule of thumb is you want to develop the muscle memory and some test shots as I was doing with on my glove. You want only a little bit of paint to come out at a time. You have to find a point when you're shooting the airbrush and you're just starting to open up the needle that you see a little bit of paint through, not like splatter. That means your tip is dirty, but you see a thin uniform mist, a small pattern form. That's the sweet spot. So it's going to be on a different airbrush. It's all going to be different depending on what airbrush you use. You have to find that right point, as well as, even sometimes just for whatever reason, maybe, a little bit of wear and needle and stuff like that. But finding that point, and then when you find that small point, you can go nice and slow and smooth using your airbrush across the entire surface. And you can slowly build up to what I've done here with the white, and you can see, pretty much meeting that max value right at the head, and everything else starts to cascade down and it's less. So let's put some Games Workshop contrast paint through the airbrush. A lot of the contrast paint actually go really well through the airbrush, and I'll be thinning it a little bit with a contrast medium. The method I do it by pouring it straight through the bottle like that, that's prone for disaster, but I did it anyway, and luckily I didn't spill any and constantly make a meme of yourself on YouTube. Spraying through the contrast paint, several layers is always key. I'm never aiming with an airbrush to get the full coverage off the first pass. Do the first pass, have it transparent, and let it sit, let it dry. Nothing is worse than just painting on wet paint with an airbrush and just building and just pushing that layer around, and it doesn't work. So after we get the Dark Angels green contrast paint layer down, we're now going to load up our airbrush, and we're going to be using dark green from AK's 3rd generation acrylic line. Again, putting that in the airbrush, thin it out approximately 1:1, and I'm using AK's acrylic thinner and running through the airbrush, exact same PSI, around 25, 28 PSI or 2 bars, and using the exact same techniques as that I demonstrated with the white, well, this time just with the green, and slowly start layering up and building. A general approach, and when I'm using the airbrush in this instance, is first thing off is the angle of the airbrush that we're using at. The angle of the godlight that's coming down is at a steep, almost 90 degrees. It'd be like 75, 80 degrees coming down. And a good thing is when you're doing the white sketch, we can really find out the best angle for you to paint that on there. You can always, again, you just use it as a sketch and a tester. So with that in here, I will apply a generally fairly even, a little bit of misting down, especially when it gets down below the legs. You gotta be very reserved, where we want to, keep the majority of our light on the upper registry, around the head, the front chest, that right shoulder that is really prominent, and a part of the jump pack back on the right side. Everything else just gets shallow illumination. Very similar to when you're also painting with the brush, is wet paint generally always looks shinier, it looks stronger, and it generally looks brighter. So take your time, and when you do a simple layer, let it dry and actually watch it. It mats out a lot more. So I never try to judge the paint when it's wet. Do a thin layer, let it dry, and then really see how it's actually turning out. To start getting the highlights here, I will start to mix parts in with pastel green. So just keeping the same dark green that's in the airbrush gun, I just add a little bit of pastel green for the second highlight. The ratio is roughly like 50-50, but I always lean into a little bit of the lesser side, so it's probably like 60-70 percent dark green with a little bit 30-40% of the pastel green. You can always do more layers, don't need to rush. Actually, if you take your time going through it, you do get a very, very nice, soft and even layering with the airbrush. You don't have to make like such dramatic jumps, and in the end you get a smoother result the thinner layers that you put in and the more you do. You can see here with this pastel green, this is where it really starts to come up with the contrast. Again, nice and slow. Remember that trigger control, finding that point that a very little amount of paint comes through, which is nice. And it's so much easier to like slowly build up your time, because even if you start to hit an area that may not have that maybe doesn't need a lot of volume or at all, it's so low in the registry that you can just quickly move and correct, and it just makes it a lot less stressful than trying to fire these big shots of paint and hoping for the best. You can almost use this very, very light mark as almost like a tracer round. Another thing to know when you're using the airbrush, you can also use audio cues to help you know where your airbrush is hitting. Just by blasting air, when it's hitting the sculpt, there's a distinctive sound to it, but if you shoot it out open when it's not hitting a surface, it makes a different sound to it. So what you can do is use that little trick where you can align it like 90 degrees to where you think you're going to hit, and you can aim off the model. And then as soon as you start pulling in and the sound starts to change, this is really good, especially for edges of models. So on the border and the edge, and you want to hit that edge, you can use the sound cue to first aim off and then just start pulling the airbrush and the air in to make sure that, okay, I'm on the model now. And you'll know, it kind of helps you dealing with some of the trickier angles through there. But in other terms, that's the level that we're going to get. I'm not going to push any brighter. I'm not going to push any brighter because the other highlights are going to come in a later stage that we're going to take care of that with the brush, just because we need more precision. The airbrush is really good for making very, very broad strokes, but when it comes to finer details, we need the brush. But as I'm doing here is I'm just going to start to tackle down the off-white areas. So that's going to be the chest with the Aquila, as well as the shield, and I also paint like the knee pad in here. The black, the parts that we are painting with this off-white area is it's going to be dark gray with black. So that's right there on the palette, that's dark gray, and I'm just mixing in black in there. Any black will do, nothing really special. But again, it's very similar when we were talking about the values that we are placing in here. I added more black in this mixture because the areas in the lower part, so like the knees and stuff, get very little light. So I'm going to start at a lower base and a lower value than it would say for the chest, which is starting off as a pretty much pure dark gray. It's funny, that name, you know, we think it's going to be even darker, but it's all on dependent of comparison, right? That dark gray doesn't look super dark, but when you put it against something light, yeah, it's going to be a lot darker, and vice versa. We're just going to prime the whole area. And as you also noticed, after I did the airbrushing, all the areas that are metal, so or are going to be gold, in this case I painted in an N&M style. They're all filled out black at the start, so just nice and easy to get that out of the way. Again, use any kind of black. I always bounce back between like different brands of paint, or just to, you know, change it up, see various effects, or in this case I'm using Vallejo scale model color black. It's actually quite nice. It's you know, it's more matte than usual than most other paints in there, and tried, tested, and true. Covers well, easy. So the main part we're going to be focusing on this off-white is on this shield. So in the highlights here, you can actually see how the curvature of the shield goes, and it's almost running like parallel to the light. So it actually doesn't get a full amount of highlight, but this kind of leaves an interesting part where the shield has a bit of a concave curve to it. So actually near the top of the shield is going to be a little more in shadow, and at the bottom is going to be, it's going to catch a little more of the light because of the curvature of the shield. The lip actually ends up opening up itself a little bit, so it's going to get a little bit of light. So the main thing is when you're, you know, painting a nice long area, we want to get a little bit of a gradient, is very dependent is going to be on brush direction. So this is the highlight we're painting, and if you notice, since I want to place more of the highlight down below, I'm going to try to keep my brush strokes going in that direction. This is really going to help because of the thinness of the paint that I have. I kind of mixed in about 25 to 30% water in there, so not just straight up thick paint, but it just allows a little bit of flow and a little bit of transparency in the paint, so it's going to be easier to blend when we do it. So again, just mixing up a little more of the shadow and just making 3 distinct tones. So right now what I'm doing is what I call a bridge blend. So I initially laid down the first darker tone, then you saw me next was gonna do the highlight, and then now I mix a tone, a value in between those two, and I bridge the two values together. So you can see that this middle value is a nice little bridge. It's not I'm not doing like a super drastic gradient here, but it does go a long way to help make a nice soft transition. Because again, this shield is kind of in a limbo position where it's not quite in shadow, it's not quite in full view of the light, it's kind of in between. But if you always look, is whatever color I'm painting, I'm always trying to pull the direction of the brush into its home color. So right now I'm painting more of the highlight, all my brush strokes are going down, so I'm pulling the paint down and then starting a new stroke. So I'm not going like back and forth here, it's just straight down all the way through. Pair that off with a little bit of the paint consistency in there, is when your brush stroke ends in general, that's where the most amount of extra little bit of paint gets deposited. And where you started, since your pulling the paint down in the brush with the brush motion, you get the smallest amount of paint deposit at the start. That way you can get a nice softer drag with the brush, and a softer mark at the start, and it's easy to make a fairly easy and a quick transition through the blend like that. And now we're getting into the more darker and lighter values. So now I'm going to go a little bit darker. And one of the things I like to do now when we're trying to increase the contrast, increase the gap between the darkness of the shadow and then the lightness, is now I start to thin the paint out a little bit more. And this will just give us, we're almost working like thick glazes here in a sense. So this shadow tone is about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. And we can actually do in the opposite as well. Working out these little highlights to make the area just a little bit interesting. Here's some little odds and ends scratches. I'm just taking the same highlight value that we created, and it's pretty much just pure dark gray, and putting little dots here and there and creating what I call like a little bit of noise. Give a highlight onto the rivets. Again, doing a little bit of edge highlighting to help bring things out and to help give that rivet a little bit of character. If you noticed, there are like 2 little casted shadows, and to really sell the idea that this shield is again in kind of like that limbo position where it's not quite in shadow, not quite in highlight, it's almost parallel to the light source. It's gonna catch those rivets and get some cast shadows on there. I love little areas like this, are always really fun to try to find, and this model, especially with coincidentally, like the positioning of it just worked so well, and painted those casted shadows. Little areas in there just give a little bit of extra detail. I'm not super worried to be absolute accurate. It's not like maybe I could have actually like taken a lamp and tried to find the exact point, but it's close enough. And again, like when you're painting, when we're doing all this stuff, we're just painting an illusion. So I'm trying to like pull off as many of these little tricks as I can, these little things in your toolbox to try to trick the eye into it. The highlight that we did with a little bit of that the dark gray is I just substitute just putting a little bit of ivory in if you need to grab a little bit of a highlight. I actually don't really use white for anything here. It's pretty much all ivory. I think at the very end I use a little bit of white, but nothing too hard. Now starting from the red, we want to use some very desaturated reds just because these reds are not very bold. They're not in the light, so they don't get a lot of chromatic value to them. As well as if I made them too saturated, I think that just like it'll draw your eye away from it. Saturated colors, lighter colors, strong contrasts are everything that we can use to our advantage to help draw the eye or focal points to. And since this red is on the knee pad in particular, I don't really want to make that the first thing or one of the highest priorities for someone to see. So creating a very desaturated red is very, very helpful. And for these colors here, I'm using a wine red base, so that's from AK. And we also have a Bordeaux red, I think that's how you pronounce it. This is again an AK's 3rd generation line, and just with a little bit of again a little bit of ivory is going to be used very sparingly, just to give us a little bit of a highlight if we need it. So pretty easy, like little, I think it's like, I don't know, company icons or something. I see them on like the knee pads and stuff. It just helps to give a little bit of interesting detail, help break it up a little bit. But the main important thing in, you know, highlighting, especially something down below, is I gotta keep these highlights really small, because the curvature of the knee, like a sphere, you know, it's already starting to curve into shadow. It's almost too big as it is, but I think that's fine. You can see just adding just a little bit of Bordeaux red into the highlights, and keep them very, very small. Again, you know, just a bit of thinning in the paint, you know, nothing too drastic, you know, 30% water to paint, not too bad, but keeping it small. And again, like if you need to do just a little bit of blending, we can use we can take advantage of the same technique that we were using on the shield there. Just be mindful of the brush direction. Always try to like brush towards the home color, just so you get a nice soft transition. Or if you really need to, and maybe the highlight got a little bit too big, we can even strategize and make a glaze out of the wine red, and just glaze over it, do a little unification. And even on an error there, you know, it's gonna happen on freehand, but the nice thing is we can just grab our previous color from the dark gray black mixture and use it as a rubber and just clean up the outside edges. No sweat. I think I actually made another error again, pretty much like making the same mistake as I did before. But you know, I go over there. Here it is, just cleaning up that transition. So I just grab that little bit of wine red, but instead of having that 30% mixture, I thin it around like 1 to 1.5, just to, you know, make a little bit of a softer mark and just clean up that transition in there. And as you can see, the brush strokes, again, pulling downwards, because that's where I want the majority, that's where I want the home color to be. And just to make that last shadow even darker, just mix some more black in, it gets the job done. Alright, as you know, we move on the off-white and red, let's get some black. So the colors that I used for this gold, I've done a lot of N&M gold, but you know, I always love to change up the recipes all the time. I think that one, it just makes it interesting, but two, trying to incorporate a few colors that are already in the piece and put them in there. So right now, the first thing that we're doing is putting down a baseline of Gobi brown, one of my favorite browns from scale 75. And if you just saw me, I just touched in a little bit. I touched in a bit of that that wine red base into there, just so it has a little bit more warmth in the gold, because just the light source that's coming down is more of a warmer source anyway, and it kind of just helps a little bit with harmonizing with the red elements and such that's in the painting. Honestly, not super necessary, but I tend to think like little details like that, even if, you know, that don't have a direct visual impact, help out as to make the whole painting a little bit more harmonious together. And now we're going to start laying down some highlights just with Gobi brown. So again, the nice thing is that we did all the airbrush work, and we could really use that as a template to figure out where we're going to be placing our highlights on for this shoulder guard. We can, you know, pretty blatantly see, as long as we get that highlighting stage of the green right, makes it a lot easier. We can see where the transition is and where we want to pull this Gobi brown to. So you can kind of see even from the miniature, there's two big areas of light on the shoulder pad. So the ones at the apex, the crown that's closest to the head, very close to where my brush is going right now. And then there's a secondary, another light that's at the bottom of the trim that's very close to the glove. This flange here, you gotta remember, even though I still want to illustrate that there is some structure, that area right there is pretty much going to be the spot where the light just comes directly into that crevice there, and it's going to pretty much bring a lot of illumination into that area to help sell the effect of this reflective material. You can see right there, even though there's a rivet there, the other rivets, they do get highlight and a little bit of like a darker shadow outlining to kind of make them pop out. But that rivet that is right next to the bright highlight, it is fine, you know, blow it out. That will just further help sell a convincing idea that, you know, the light at its apex there is at its strongest, and you know, the material, there's a lot of light bouncing around, and it's pretty much going to almost like obscure that detail. I think that's always an interesting thing with like N&M in general, is that a lot of things that are like highly polished metal and stuff, they almost lose their shapes because of there's so much light, and it's only on the outer edges where there's more shadow. In that balanced area around there, that's where you can actually see most of the detail, or like, yeah, and most of the structure, because there's a balance between light and shadow, and you know, it's on more the edges of where the light is coming in directly. Anything in direct light with like a lot of reflective rebounding and stuff, we tend to like lose the image. If you want little examples, you can always like Google image or use Pinterest, and you look at really shiny metal objects. Like a good one for like detail is like old fine gold plates and stuff from like Victorian era that have a lot of like relief and filigree and patterns that are shaped into the gold plates and such. And it's funny because you can't, right where the light is really hitting, you can't really see exactly what the plate is. Like, it's very hard to see all the detail at once, but you can see other detailed relief on the edges of the light rather than right where it is. So we can always use that kind of like that effect to its advantage and see why that's happening. Sorry, to go back to the colors there, if you saw. So we have I've been starting to mix in some English uniform, which is right there, and then to the right of the English uniform is Japanese uniform. So this English uniform mixed with this Gobi brown, they tend to be on the very similar same family, but great paints for making gold. You know, nothing too saturated. You know, I don't want to put a lot of strong yellow in here at all. But, you know, that's totally to your flavor. I think the number one thing we really want to commit when we're doing this gold as well is to keep an idea of our values. So when we start getting into the English uniform, you know, we've taken care of the lower value areas of the metal. Now we're gonna start making some areas pop really soon. But the nice thing is, like, when you mix this English and Japanese uniform, that's where most of the most amount of yellow is gonna live in here, and then after that it's gonna shoot up. We're gonna mix a lot more ivory into the mix and really make that shine. But remember, especially if you're like following along, you're copying this. If you notice, I'm not doing a lot of like, there's no actual like, not much of a blending stage. We're just going up in sequential order, doing the layering. And again, keep your paints a little bit thin, you know, thin them out 30%, 40. You can even do like a 50-50. In this model, I've tried to keep the layers a little bit thicker, is because, well, you know, I want to be able to finish this in a relatively good time. And, you know, I'm not aiming for like competition prep level here. You know, I'm just, you know, I want to paint that's something that's effective, but still a little bit more respectable of the time. So here you can see there's a mixture between the English and Japanese uniform along with some ivory. This is where we start building up the light, where we start to see more impact of the highlight now. And of course, when we move up in these upper highlights, this is where I can start to thin the paint out a little bit more, just to be a little bit softer, because we were getting the highlight areas are going to be smaller. And this is pretty much where the paint mixture gets roughly around like 1:1 now. And again, to help with those highlights, to help with those transitions in between, we can again use the brush direction to give us a helping hand, so we get a little bit more of a fade going on. You can even see that I've been highlighting the inverted edge in that shoulder pad. So even though there's that groove, it's very easy to, you know, give that a shade. But when that part of the miniature is pretty much facing towards the light, even an inverted edge can still would act as like an edge highlight. Be it doesn't get as intense as an edge highlight, but in order to help out the volume, you know, the inverted edge will still gather a little bit more light than its flatter counterparts to the left and the right. And again, as we move up into the brighter highlights, well, just add more ivory and just give her. This is probably like, this is where like N&M I think gets a lot of excitement. The first initial stages are always a little bit of a, you know, I'm not going to say head scratcher. I've seen it enough now that, you know, I know what to be looking for. But I would think that, especially when I was, you know, getting more in tune with this this subject of painting, and I think for many of you that if N&M is something what new, getting to grips and identifying if you're on the right path is very, very helpful. And take notes when you're, you know, seeing this process go through and what each stage should look like. You know, some people either tend to rush, you know, blasting it with white right away, and then it doesn't really come out the way they want it to, because they're missing, even though these very, very thin slivers of the various midtones, but a little bit of like, especially the colors of the English and Japanese uniform, when you mix them together, even though you don't see a lot of that yellow in the end result, but it's that little bit will help sell it really coming through. But if we miss that, then, well, yeah, it can end up looking a little bit off. This is me here just playing around, just trying to make a warmer off tone, which is, you know, out of making a little bit of a reflective color that's going to be present in the metals. And what I'm doing now is creating a glaze out of that. So I made like this kind of red mixture, which is with some Gobi brown. And what I want to do is I'm going to start glazing that into the shadows. This is just going to give a little bit of color variation into my shadows and lower midtones, and just bring a little bit of a tonal interest into here. This could be very similar to like using like N&M, and then you start glazing in like Morphang brown, or maybe a little bit of an orange. I don't know if you've ever seen like what I did with the lion. You know, I made an orange as an off reflective color. So a little tonal change in the gold, just to bring more interest and help the area just come with a little more liveliness in the metal. We have to really remember that, you know, gold and N&M products are like the subject. It's about a reflective area or a reflective material, so it's gaining colors from the rest of the atmosphere. And I thought just adding a little bit red into the recesses and just giving a little bit of a change was beneficial. All right, so here's some classic wargaming stuff that we're going to be doing in enamel pin wash. This stuff was this set was sent to me from AK, and we'll be using it in our miniatures for this one. And again, like such a cool technique that, you know, we've used before for army painting. So I kind of fast forward to here. I didn't show the decal process. I think there's other videos that show it really easy. Just search up microset and microsol, and you can watch people apply decals. That's exactly what I've done. But after giving it like a nice gloss varnish, it helps with the decals, but it's also going to help with this pin wash, because we want a nice, smooth, shiny surface for us to apply these enamel washes on. Now, the two enamel washes that I used was that grayish green for the armor, and then we're going to be using the brown wash for all the off-white elements. But the thing to note here is on the tray that I have actually just behind is actually just the mineral spirit, or they have some stuff that smells fruity. Really like cheap bad cologne. So when you apply this pin wash, and what you want to do is what I'm doing with the thinner here is kind of just like removing and cleaning the surface. So when you apply the pin wash, you might get in areas that, you know, that we don't want the wash to be there. The most important thing is to protect your highlights. Do not allow this wash to gather on especially on the brightest highlights. So you can just take a little bit of thinner on your brush, and you can see that I'm just like carefully just like getting my brush a little bit moist, that word, and not pooling, and you want to just pull them off away so it's not going to be sitting right in the center of the highlight. Taking this brown wash, really nice to, especially on the Aquila. There's a lot of cool details, especially, and of course on the Aquila in here. Now I'm only going to use this pin wash if I need to get into the shadows. I do not put this at all on the shield, simply because there's no recesses that this color needs to go into. So, and you know, don't take it like, oh, just place this on every single white surface. Well, we don't need it on the shield. No grooves, but there are a lot of grooves into the Aquila. But one thing you do notice as well is after I apply the pin wash, I then remove the leftover wash on my brush, apply a little bit of spirit, and I start to remove it in areas that the light was going to be, just like in the Aquila, or just like how we were pin washing the head, that I start to clean the area. I start to use the mineral spirit to remove, and especially where the Aquila is, where the chest is, because there's a lot of light there. So, you know, thinning / removing it from there is remove the intensity of it, I think is really key, because we don't want it such a hard stain. So that's what the pin wash looks like after it's completely dry, and I've also applied a coat of ultramatte varnish onto there, both to just to change the finish so we can paint our brush back on there, and we get a more true representation of the values that we have on the model. And now we're going to be doing the brush portion of it, so this is really going to help give our model the extra pop. So on the palette here, from left to right, are the two same greens we were using through the airbrush. So that's the dark green by AK, as well as pastel green. To the right of that, sorry, the camera is a little bit blown out, but to the right of that was sunny skin tone, and then I have ivory on the right side too. So a really good strategy for painting on the brush strokes on these highlights, especially on the volumes, is going to be two things. First off, start in the center. It's very similar to like freehand. If you start your highlights in the very center, even if you get the value wrong, you're at least going to paint there. You're at least going to paint there again, so you can always make corrections. And also, you know, getting a good central target also keeps the rest of your painting in line. Don't start on the edge of the highlight and work into the center. You're probably just going to create more problems as it is. And of course, when we're painting these highlights, it's always easier to grow the highlight than to shrink it. You know, if you make them too big, you can always, you know, there's always correct. It's just paint. But you know, I like to do the least destructive method. So when mixing the dark green and the pastel green, it might take a couple of tries to find out what value to start off with. So good thing is, of course, to start in the middle, do a stroke, and then let it dry, then see how it dries and if you matched it or not. Almost every time though, the nice thing is when you're using brush paint versus airbrush paint, it's always going to come out a little bit different, because also your brush makes different strokes and different marks. And even though the same value from your airbrush won't look the same when you find the same value with your brush, it just doesn't. But we can also use, again, the same little trick when I was talking about brush direction also applies here. Oh, surprise, surprise. Always pull in to the color that we're working with. So since we were doing highlights and we're highlighting upwards, if you notice, my brush direction is always going inwards towards the central point of the light. So on the head, well, dead center. So that light source is coming straight in the center of the head. So all my brush strokes are pretty much going to be all in that direction. This again just helps with keeping the image of the highlight smooth. It helps with the natural transitions, so I don't have to spend ages on blending in between each layer. And even the brush direction itself, like the strokes, the pattern that it makes, it also just helps guide our eye towards central lighting, and it flows in the direction of the miniature that we're painting, so, and the feeling of it. So win-win-win. When making these light highlights, this is where I've switched this is where I'm going to be like using a lot thinner paint. So the consistency of here that I'm painting right now is about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. And just because, you know, we're just doing like highlight work now. So, and you know, there's not nearly as much of it fun thing is about painting this scheme is like, well, we're not painting the back. So I could spend more time working on the front to make it really good, is because that's the entire goal of this miniature. And if you're copying the same scheme, well, then hopefully that's your goal too. Or maybe you came up with something new and creative that I didn't think about yet, and you can add to it, which is totally fine. Make it yours. But like I said, you can just create and just really focus at this these few angles that really make the model pop. And again, doing these little areas, just really watch your charge, keep it nice and light, and yeah, just to enjoy the process. You can see even like little bits of like a little bit of the wash may have gone a little bit too strong, but this is where you can use the brush here just to cover and correct. I think if anything, this is one of the funnest parts, is to really like how bright you can make this face go. It pays to be like, if you get some highlight brush and slips into the eyes, no big deal. We'll be painting the eyes, of course, later. But if you can, try to leave a little bit of like the tiniest threads of space on those shadows. It's a lot easier to judge. Have something contrast and to judge how bright you're going to be going on here. But for the most part, like I even said at the beginning of the video in the intro, that I wish I actually went even like brighter, like bigger, more importantly. Like I wish I made the highlights even bigger. But I think for all intents and purposes, works out. Even more so when you're doing these highlights, it's almost like a less is more approach. The biggest mistake we can have on doing this effect is over highlighting beyond its boundaries, or even on here in the head. I don't want to pull this highlight too far back, because you really have to keep in mind where the light is coming from, and you got to realize that this head, just like a sphere, there's the back part's gonna curve away, so don't bring too much light, especially it goes past that curvature. Right here is a really good illustration of all the major light points that I do highlight. Everything else kind of gets a back seat, but those are the main points that we really want to focus on. And to get these areas here is mixing in pastel green. I don't reach pure pastel green. Before it gets to pure pastel green, that's where I start adding a little bit of sunny skin tone in. This is to make the light warmer. I don't want just almost a blank light coming out through. I actually wanted the light to be have a little more warmth to it. This just really helps give a little more temperature variation and more temperature contrast, as the dark green that we're using is under the, it's a cooler color. So to help out the highlights, to gain more contrast without just fumbling into white, we can make the highlights warmer. And sunny skin tone is one of those great colors that really, well, even the name says sunny. And it doesn't have to be for skin. It's just like this very warm, nice warm, desaturated color that we can apply in the highlights here, just to give a warmer temperature to our max lights. And since we can use this, we can get a little more dynamic range and a little more brightness in our highlights, instead of just falling into just doing pure white. Because if we just added white into these highlights with this pastel green, we would soon actually run out of room, and you wouldn't be able to get a little more of a dynamic range in there. But let temperature take some of the weight and change within this contrast. And we can pull these highlights a little bit more. We can see a little more detail in the progression. And also just creates a little bit more interest, you know, just staying in one temperature range, either all warm or all cool. It has a place in all paintings. Like, don't say that's wrong, but I think I always like to, you know, look for opportunities where you can add variant methods of contrast, not just rely on the tried, tested, and true value, you know, dark to light. You know, that's the whole idea of also like mixing, you know, mixing complementary colors into the base tone to desaturate a color. Rather than just using black, you get a more pleasant tonal variation that's a little bit more smoother and more harmonious. And then the same thing with like temperature. We could have like how we have here in this green, we have a cold base, and then the highlights start getting warmer. Little detail that I'm painting here is another thing to kind of enhance the gold, and it's nothing to painting directly on the gold. It's painting a little bit of a rebounding reflective light that comes off the trim of that shoulder pad and just strikes in a small little area on the grain. Little details like that, again, just little things that are pleasant, little small victories that, you know, give you a little bit of extra detail and a little bit of more of a win when it comes to these little things. And this temperature thing especially comes into effect when we have a very small area such as the face, and we're looking for a good sweep and a good value range. Even though like most of this is all in highlight, it's almost blown out, but we still want to see the detail, right? So we need we need to be able to view the change. So again, working in a strategy with using some temperature variation just goes a long way to making this helmet keep its details, because we still want to be able to see the vents, the little curvatures, little details of like the inner mask where compared to the rest of the helmet, the earpieces and the vents and stuff. We want to be able to see all that stuff. So yeah, the little temperature change really helps. And this can go for anything. It doesn't have to be on this Space Marine 2. Give it a try. It's really cool to grab like sunny skin tone or like a very peachy pastel color, like ivory, or maybe and try mixing it in with your other colors. I think you'll be quite surprised, and you'll get a different feeling evoked from maybe instead of just adding, you know, if you're so used to adding white to get highlight, try adding a slightly different, very light pastel color, and you know, have fun with those results. Here I'm just making little adjustments. I noticed that, oh, you know what, I need to bring this highlight down more. The shoulder pad needs more more light in there, so just growing it, and just, you know, being careful in its application, doing little overlapping layers. Again, with these parts, you know, keeping the paint pretty thin. Now, again, keeping it at 1 to 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint when working over this. Just doing my best to, you know, not paint over completely the decal. with all these little various strokes, one of the main thing that I'm really looking for is the strokes I'm not doing are not just random. When I'm really looking at these highlights is I'm looking for little gaps in between the finish, and that's where my brush strokes are actually going. So don't think I'm just doing random scribbles in areas to give highlights. Actually, each stroke I'm just looking, and I'm looking at little gaps, and it most commonly comes in between two strokes. So if I like layer up, if I do like parallel strokes in between, or side by side of each other, sometimes there's like a little hairline gap that's in between, or the finish is not even. And that's what I'm really looking at, and applying just a little bit of paint to kind of fill it in and be more solid. And the idea of it being more solid is closer to the highlight. So between each transitional stage, like if you kind of want to break this down into like, there's roughly like 3 or 4 more visible stages that, you know, they're not very, I'm trying to eliminate them as much as possible, but you can kind of still distinctly see around 1, 2, 3, yeah, like 4 different like main stages of these highlights. It becomes more loose and ragged at the end of each layer, but gets more dense and compact the closer you get to the highlight. And that's what you know, kind of gives like this fade with just with a little bit of brush stroke and character. You know, I don't need it to be like super glass smooth. Is also, I don't, you know, this material, the ceramite armor is not of that characteristic. I still want it to have a little bit of feeling, a little bit of roughness to it. It is battle armor, but at the same time, I'm not featuring like a million scratches and nicks. Simply because I just didn't want that to be more of the showcase. I wanted more of the light to drive the model, and this really, really bright value at the face. Here to help out the highlights even more, now I can switch it up, and I've made our bright highlight into a glaze. So mixing around like 4 to 5 parts water to 1 part paint. Pretty not a super thin glaze, but enough that that helps, that makes a very, very soft mark, and just dragging it, starting the brush stroke in the, not the mid-tone, but in the, you know, in the previous layer, and pulling up and doing quick brush strokes and pulling up into the max highlight, just to soften out those transitions a little bit more, just as a little final finishing touch. As well as, since I am, you know, starting in almost the entire previous layer and pulling upwards, I'm actually just increasing the value as a whole, making that area brighter. Now to get some eyes. First off, just, this is where a lot of patience, you know, just get the black. And first off, filling the eye black, and then this is where I grab white, or you can use ivory, doesn't matter, and create that outline. The same reds I actually use in the base red is that Bordeaux red, and I'm painting that right over the white to get as much vibrancy as I can out of that, well, for the most part, the desaturated red. And then I'm just going to add ivory straight into the red mix and create a few highlights through that. Even just with a touch of sunny skin tone, again, because I want that the lens to reflect a little bit of that warm, the warm light that's coming in here. And then a shine in the back of the lens, and then another shine at the very, very front. It's one of the few times where I would also make shines on these lenses that are very symmetrical. Just due to the light placement being dead center. And there you have it. So that's pretty much the finished painting. During this shot right here, the only other things that I did was just quickly kind of scribbled in a little bit of brown gray in the cloak. Nothing fantastic, as well as the holster. I don't think many people really paid attention to that, and I didn't include it on here because it's, you know, it's just pretty dull and side boring stuff, which is not part of the focal. And you know, you could do anything with it. You could just make sure that the colors that you use on the brown and stuff are very just saturated. You know, don't put a lot of sienna or a lot of ochre in there. We really don't want to have a lot of color because that would pull too much emphasis onto those tertiary elements, or they're not really the focal point of that. But I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video and enjoyed this painting, and it's something just, you know, a little bit different, you know, not about the army or anything like that, but you know, it just shows you that you can change up your lighting schemes and, you know, have fun with it. I think that was the number one thing that I wanted to have with this model, is to just enjoy myself and not paid for the tabletop, and just be a little more creatively free, both in the paint scheme, but as well as how this piece is going to be looked and perceived. It sits in my cabinet, and the funny thing is, with all the other models I've painted, even ones with like elaborate cloaks, I don't get to see them that often because, well, they're mostly facing forward. So, you know, a model like this, even though I didn't paint the back, well, it's just going to be a display piece, and without a revolving turntable, it's just going to be facing forward. But yeah, but otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the video. I really hope that you learned something in the creative process and possibly got your minds kind of stirring up, and, you know, thinking what kind of models can, you know, you do and include. That includes maybe a god light, or, you know, exploring other lighting situations and other creative possibilities that are not of the tabletop norm. But other than that, thanks very much for watching the video, and we'll catch you in the next one. Happy painting.